Welcome to Night Crime Stories. Tonight, we examine the case of the Unabomber, a brilliant mathematician turned domestic terrorist who waged an 18-year campaign of fear from the shadows. His carefully crafted bombs targeted those he blamed for technology's rise, leaving investigators chasing ghosts. Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the case unfold. Maintain a steady, contemplative pace throughout. This is a story about patience, persistence, and the power of never giving up. The tone should be respectful to the victim while acknowledging the complexity of cold case investigations. Emphasize the methodical nature of detective work and the emotional weight carried by families waiting for answers. Good evening. I'm here with you tonight to share a story that spans 4 decades. A story about a young life cut short, a family's enduring pain, and the relentless pursuit of justice that never truly ends, even when it seems all hope is lost. Tonight, we travel to Flint, Michigan, in the autumn of 1983. Ronald Reagan is president. MTV is changing how young people consume music. Personal computers are becoming more common in American homes. It's a time of transition, of technological advancement, yet some things remain tragically constant. Violence still lurks in ordinary places. Predators still walk among us. And sometimes, justice takes far longer to arrive than anyone could imagine. This is the story of 16-year-old Sherry Jo, whose murder would remain unsolved for over 4 decades. It's a story about the limitations of 1980s forensic science, the persistence of modern investigators, and the bitter irony of resolution coming just moments too late. It's about DNA evidence that would eventually speak for the dead, and about a killer who would take his final secret to the grave. As we begin tonight, I want you to consider the weight of waiting. The weight of questions without answers. The weight of a case file gathering dust while a family never stops wondering who took their daughter away. And the weight of truth, when it finally emerges from decades of darkness. November 16, 1983, dawned gray and cold in Flint, Michigan. The industrial city, once proud home to General Motors manufacturing, was beginning to feel the economic pressures that would define its future struggles. But for most residents, it was simply another Wednesday, another school day, another step toward the approaching Thanksgiving holiday. Sherry Jo prepared for school that morning like any other 16-year-old might. She gathered her books, said goodbye to her family, and headed out into the crisp autumn air. At 16, she was at that pivotal age where childhood gives way to young adulthood. She had dreams, plans, friends who mattered to her. She was navigating the complex social world of high school with all its pressures and possibilities. The school day proceeded normally. Teachers conducted their lessons. Students moved through hallways, attended classes, shared lunch period conversations. Sherry Jo was present, participating in the ordinary rhythm of academic life. Nothing about this particular Wednesday suggested it would be different from any other. Nothing indicated that by evening, a family's world would be forever changed. But when the final bell rang and students began their familiar exodus from the building, something went wrong. Somewhere between the school grounds and her home, Sherry Jo vanished. The details of her disappearance remain largely unknown even today. There were no obvious witnesses to an abduction. No clear signs of a struggle in any particular location. No immediate evidence of foul play. When evening came and Sherry Jo failed to return home, her family's concern grew quickly. This wasn't typical behavior for her. She wasn't the type to disappear without explanation or to worry her family unnecessarily. Phone calls were made to friends. Common hangout spots were checked. The usual network of teenage social connections was contacted. But no one had seen her after school ended. No one knew where she had gone. By the time darkness fell over Flint that November evening, it was clear that something was seriously wrong. The family contacted local police, beginning what would become one of the longest-running investigations in the area's history. Officers took the initial report, gathered basic information about Sherry Jo's appearance and last known whereabouts, and began the systematic process of searching for a missing teenager. In 1983, missing persons investigations relied heavily on traditional police work. There were no cell phones to ping for location data. No social media profiles to analyze. No extensive network of surveillance cameras to review. Officers had to depend on witness interviews, physical searches, and the slow process of following up leads as they developed. The investigation would be methodical but limited by the technology of the era. The first 48 hours of any missing persons case are considered critical. During this window, the chances of finding someone alive are statistically highest. But as Thursday turned to Friday, and Friday gave way to the weekend, hope began to fade. Sherry Joe's disappearance was no longer just a worried family's concern. It was becoming a police investigation with increasingly dark possibilities. 4 days. 4 agonizing days of uncertainty, fear, and desperate hope. 4 days of searching, questioning, and following leads that led nowhere. 4 days of a family clinging to the possibility that their daughter might still walk through the front door with an explanation that would make everything make sense again. On Sunday, November 20th, that hope died. The discovery came not through the systematic police search, but through the terrible chance that often marks the most tragic moments in criminal cases. Someone unconnected to the investigation, going about their own business in a wooded area outside of Flint, stumbled upon what no one wants to find. The body of a young woman, clearly the victim of violence. The scene was immediately secured by responding officers. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was now a homicide investigation. The protocols changed instantly. Crime scene technicians were called in. The medical examiner was notified. Detectives specializing in violent crimes took over the case. What had been a search for a missing teenager became a hunt for a killer. Initial examination of the scene revealed the brutal reality of what had happened to Sherry Joe. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been shot. The violence inflicted upon her spoke to a perpetrator capable of extreme cruelty. This wasn't a crime of passion that escalated beyond control. This was a predatory act by someone willing to kidnap, assault, and murder a 16-year-old girl. The location where her body was found became the focus of intense scrutiny. Investigators photographed every detail, collected every piece of potential evidence, and mapped the area with meticulous precision. In 1983, forensic science was advancing rapidly, but it was still limited compared to today's capabilities. DNA analysis was in its infancy. Fingerprint technology was sophisticated but required clear impressions. Investigators had to rely primarily on physical evidence they could see and analyze with available methods. The medical examiner's preliminary findings confirmed what the scene had suggested. Sherry Joe had been the victim of a sexual assault followed by homicide. The cause of death was determined to be gunshot wounds. The manner of death was clearly homicide. But beyond these basic facts, the forensic evidence available in 1983 could tell investigators relatively little about who might have committed these crimes. News of the discovery spread quickly through the Flint community. A 16-year-old girl had been kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered. Parents held their children closer. Students at Sherry Joe's high school struggled to process the reality that someone their own age had been killed in such a horrific manner. The sense of safety that allows communities to function normally was shattered. For Sherry Joe's family, the discovery brought a different kind of anguish. The uncertainty was over, but it had been replaced by the terrible certainty of loss. Their daughter was never coming home. She would never graduate from high school, never go to college, never marry, never have children of her own. All of those future possibilities had been stolen by someone who had reduced a vibrant young life to an object of violence. The investigation now faced the enormous challenge of identifying the perpetrator. In a case with no clear witnesses to the abduction, limited physical evidence, and forensic technology still in development, detectives would need to rely on careful police work, community cooperation, and perhaps some measure of luck to solve Sherry Joe's murder. The Flint Police Department assembled its most experienced investigators to work Sherry Joe's case. Detective work in the 1980s required a different skill set than today's technology-enhanced investigations. Officers had to be master interviewers, capable of reading people and detecting deception through conversation alone. They had to be meticulous record keepers, since there were no digital databases to search or cross-reference information instantly. Every lead had to be followed manually, every connection made through human analysis and intuition. The initial phase of the investigation focused on Sherry Joe's known associates and daily routines. Detectives interviewed her family members, friends, classmates, and teachers. They wanted to understand her social circle, her habits, her typical routes to and from school. They looked for anyone who might have shown unusual interest in her, anyone who might have made her uncomfortable, anyone whose behavior had seemed inappropriate or threatening. These interviews revealed a picture of a typical teenager living a normal life. Sherry Joe wasn't involved in high-risk behaviors. She wasn't known to associate with older men or to frequent dangerous locations. She wasn't involved in drugs or other illegal activities that might have brought her into contact with violent criminals. By all accounts, she was simply a 16-year-old girl going to school and living her life when she encountered someone with deadly intentions. The randomness of her victimization made the case more challenging to solve. When victims are involved in criminal activities or have known enemies, investigators have clear starting points for their inquiries. But when someone like Sherry Joe is targeted, it suggests either a case of wrong place and wrong time, or a predator who selected her specifically for reasons known only to him. Physical evidence from the crime scene was carefully analyzed using the best forensic techniques available in 1983. Fingerprint experts examined every surface that might have retained usable prints. Ballistics specialists analyzed the bullets and shell casings to determine what type of weapon had been used. Fibers, hairs, and other trace evidence were collected and catalogued in case they might later prove significant. The sexual assault component of the crime meant that biological evidence had likely been left behind. However, in 1983, DNA analysis was not yet available as an investigative tool. The first criminal case to use DNA evidence wouldn't occur until 1986, and the technology wouldn't become widely available to law enforcement agencies for several more years. This meant that biological evidence from Sherry Joe's case could be preserved but not immediately analyzed for identification purposes. Investigators also canvassed the area where her body was found, looking for anyone who might have seen suspicious activity in the days before the discovery. They checked for tire tracks that might indicate what type of vehicle the perpetrator had used. They looked for any physical evidence that might have been discarded nearby. They mapped out possible routes the killer might have taken to reach the disposal site. The investigation expanded to include known sex offenders in the area. In 1983, there was no centralized database of sex offenders, and registration requirements were far less comprehensive than today. Nevertheless, detectives identified and interviewed local men with histories of sexual violence, looking for anyone whose methods or preferences might match the crimes committed against Sherry Joe. By the spring of 1984, 6 months after Sherry Joe's murder, the investigation had reached what detectives call a plateau. All obvious leads had been exhausted. All initial suspects had been cleared through alibi verification or lack of physical evidence connecting them to the crime. The case was still actively worked, but progress had slowed dramatically. This is the point where many investigations begin their transformation from active cases to cold cases. Not through any official decision or formal declaration, but through the gradual shift of resources toward newer crimes with fresher leads and better prospects for resolution. It's a harsh reality of police work that limited manpower and budget constraints force difficult choices about where to focus investigative efforts. But Sherry Joe's case was never officially closed. Her file remained in the Active Homicide Division, and detectives continued to review it periodically. New techniques were applied as they became available. New technologies were utilized when they proved relevant. The case lived in that liminal space between active investigation and cold case status, never quite forgotten but never quite solved. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, various developments in forensic science offered new hope for solving old cases. DNA analysis became available and increasingly sophisticated. Computer databases allowed for better cross-referencing of information. Improved ballistics technology provided more detailed analysis of weapons evidence. Each advancement was applied to Sherry Joe's case when appropriate, but none produced the breakthrough needed for resolution. The biological evidence collected from the crime scene was preserved through all these years, waiting for the day when technology might be able to extract useful information from it. Evidence storage and preservation protocols improved significantly during this period, ensuring that crucial materials wouldn't be lost or degraded while waiting for analysis. The development of national databases for DNA profiles, fingerprints, and ballistics evidence opened new possibilities for solving cold cases. Investigators could now compare evidence from their unsolved cases against evidence from cases across the country, potentially linking crimes committed by the same perpetrator in different jurisdictions. Sherry Joe's case was entered into these databases as they became available. Family members never gave up hope that their daughter's killer would eventually be identified and brought to justice. They stayed in contact with investigators, provided new information when it became available, and kept Sherry Joe's memory alive in their community. Their persistence served as both inspiration and obligation for the detectives who inherited the case over the years. The emotional weight of unsolved cases affects investigators in ways that are difficult for outsiders to understand. Each unsolved murder represents not just a professional failure, but a personal responsibility that extends far beyond the end of a detective's shift. The victims' families aren't the only ones who live with unanswered questions and frustrated hopes for justice. The investigators carry those burdens as well. The passage of time has a strange effect on unsolved murders. Years turn into decades, and cases that once dominated newspaper headlines fade from public memory. New crimes capture public attention. New tragedies demand police resources. The urgency that drives fresh investigations gradually gives way to the steady, patient work of cold case review. For Sherry Joe's family, however, time moved differently. Birthdays came and went without her presence. Graduations, weddings, births of grandchildren, all the major life events that should have included her happened in her absence. The wound of her loss never fully healed because the questions surrounding her death were never answered. Who killed her? Why was she targeted? Was her killer still alive, perhaps having committed other crimes? The 1990s brought significant advances in DNA technology. What had been impossible in 1983 was becoming routine by the mid-1990s. Cold cases across the country were being solved through DNA analysis of preserved evidence. Sherry Joe's case was among those re-examined using these new capabilities. But the results were frustrating. While DNA profiles could be extracted from the biological evidence, there were no matches in the available databases. This created a new category of cold case, crimes where investigators had a DNA profile of the perpetrator but no way to identify him. The evidence was there, preserved and analyzed, waiting for the day when a suspect might be identified through other means and then compared against the DNA profile. It was progress, but incomplete progress. The turn of the millennium brought even more sophisticated forensic techniques. Improved DNA analysis methods could extract usable profiles from smaller and more degraded samples. Computer technology allowed for more detailed analysis and comparison of evidence. But technological advancement also highlighted the limitations of older investigations. Evidence that hadn't been collected properly in 1983 couldn't be recovered decades later. During these years, other cases from the same era were being solved through a combination of new technology and persistent investigation. Each success in solving a decades-old murder brought renewed attention to other cold cases, including Sherry Joe's. But success also brought disappointment when the same techniques that worked for other cases failed to produce results for her investigation. The expansion of DNA databases throughout the 2000s and 2010s created new opportunities for cold case resolution. As more people were arrested and their DNA profiles entered into the system, there were more chances for matches with unknown profiles from unsolved crimes. Investigators periodically ran Sherry Joe's case DNA profile against the expanding databases, always hoping for the match that would finally identify her killer. Genealogical DNA analysis emerged as a revolutionary tool for cold case investigation in the late 2010s. This technique uses public genealogy databases to identify potential relatives of unknown DNA profiles, allowing investigators to build family trees and eventually identify suspects. Cases that had been unsolvable for decades were suddenly being resolved through genealogical DNA analysis. But this new technique required DNA profiles of sufficient quality and quantity to be suitable for genealogical analysis. Not all cold cases had evidence that met these requirements. The biological evidence from Sherry Joe's case was nearly 4 decades old, collected using 1983 techniques, and stored using 1983 protocols. Whether it would be suitable for genealogical analysis remained to be seen. In 2023, 40 years after Sherry Joe's murder, her case file was pulled from storage once again. This wasn't unusual. Cold cases are periodically reviewed, especially when new techniques become available or when investigators have time to focus on older unsolved crimes. But this review would be different. This time, the technology and the evidence would finally align in a way that could provide answers. The investigator assigned to review Sherry Joe's case brought both experience with modern forensic techniques and familiarity with the challenges of decades-old evidence. The first step was to assess what physical evidence was still available and what condition it was in. After 40 years, some degradation was inevitable, but proper storage had preserved the most crucial materials. The DNA profile that had been extracted from biological evidence in the 1990s was re-examined using current standards. While the profile was partial, not complete enough for traditional database searches, it might be sufficient for genealogical DNA analysis. This technique required less complete profiles than traditional forensic DNA analysis, making it potentially useful for older cases with degraded evidence. The process of genealogical DNA analysis is both scientifically complex and methodically painstaking. The DNA profile from the crime scene evidence is compared against millions of profiles in genealogy databases, looking for partial matches that might indicate family relationships. These partial matches are then used to construct family trees, identifying common ancestors and mapping relationships between the unknown subject and known individuals. When the analysis was complete, investigators had identified several potential family lines that could include Sherry Joe's killer. The next phase involved traditional genealogical research, examining birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, and other public documents to trace family relationships and identify specific individuals who might be candidates for comparison. This genealogical detective work narrowed the possibilities to a manageable number of potential suspects. Each candidate was evaluated based on age, location in 1983, criminal history, and other factors that might make them more or less likely to have been Sherry Joe's killer. The investigation was finally focusing on specific individuals rather than searching blindly for an unknown perpetrator. By early 2024, the genealogical analysis had identified a prime candidate, a man who would have been in his early 30s in 1983, living in the Flint area at the time of the murder. His name was Ronald Collins, and his background included some troubling elements that made him a person of interest in the case. Collins had a history of minor criminal offenses, though nothing in his record suggested he was capable of kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. However, investigators knew that many killers have unremarkable criminal histories until they commit their most serious crimes. The absence of a violent criminal record didn't eliminate him as a suspect. The challenge now was obtaining a DNA sample from Collins for comparison against the profile from Sherry Joe's case. By 2024, Collins was 75 years old and living in Grand Blanc, Michigan, not far from where the original crime had occurred. Investigators would need to approach him carefully, either securing his voluntary cooperation or obtaining a court order for a DNA sample. January 2026 marked a milestone that few people involved in Sherry Joe's case ever expected to reach. Investigators were ready to confront a suspect with credible evidence linking him to the 43-year-old murder. The genealogical DNA analysis had provided them with a target, and now it was time to determine whether Ronald Collins was indeed the man who had killed a 16-year-old girl in 1983. The decision to approach Collins was not made lightly. Investigators had spent months verifying the genealogical analysis, double-checking their work, and ensuring they had the strongest possible case before making contact with their suspect. They knew they would have only one opportunity to handle this confrontation properly. If Collins refused to cooperate and they lacked sufficient evidence for a search warrant, their best lead in 43 years might disappear forever. On a cold January morning, investigators arrived at Collins' residence in Grand Blanc. The 75-year-old man who answered the door had been living with the secret of Sherry Joe's murder for more than 4 decades. He had watched the investigation unfold in news reports, had seen the periodic appeals for information, had perhaps wondered whether he would ever be caught. Now, finally, that day had arrived. The initial conversation between investigators and Collins was carefully managed. They needed to assess his willingness to cooperate while avoiding any statements or actions that might compromise their legal position. They explained that they were investigating a cold case and that DNA evidence had led them to him as a potential source of information. They asked if he would be willing to provide a DNA sample for elimination purposes. Collins' response to this request would determine how the investigation proceeded. If he agreed to provide a sample voluntarily, investigators could quickly determine whether he was their suspect. If he refused, they would need to seek a court order, a process that would take time and might alert Collins to the seriousness of their interest in him. What happened next shocked everyone involved in the case. Rather than agreeing to provide a DNA sample or refusing and demanding to speak with an attorney, Collins made a different choice entirely. He told the investigators he needed time to think about their request. He asked them to return later. And then, after they left, he took his own life. The suicide was discovered hours later when investigators returned to follow up on their morning visit. Collins had died by gunshot wound, apparently self-inflicted. He left no note explaining his actions or confessing to any crimes. His death created a new set of challenges for the investigation, transforming what should have been a straightforward DNA comparison into a much more complex situation. Investigators immediately secured the scene and contacted the medical examiner. Collins' death would be investigated as a suicide, following standard protocols. But the timing of his death, occurring just hours after he had been questioned about a 43-year-old murder case, suggested that he knew why investigators had come to see him. The medical examiner's autopsy of Collins provided investigators with the opportunity they had been seeking. As part of the standard autopsy procedure, biological samples were collected that could be used for DNA analysis. Even though Collins had died before providing a voluntary sample, his death had inadvertently provided investigators with the genetic material they needed to determine whether he was Sherry Joe's killer. The DNA comparison was expedited given the circumstances of Collins' death. Laboratory technicians worked to extract a complete DNA profile from the autopsy samples and compare it against the profile developed from evidence in Sherry Joe's case. After 43 years of waiting, the answer to the question of who killed Sherry Joe was finally within reach. The DNA results were conclusive. Ronald Collins was a match to the biological evidence recovered from Sherry Joe's murder scene in 1983. After more than 4 decades of investigation, the identity of her killer was finally known with scientific certainty. The case that had haunted investigators and devastated a family was finally solved. But the resolution came with a bitter irony that would be difficult for anyone to accept. Collins had taken the answers to his grave. There would be no confession explaining why he had targeted Sherry Joe. No details about how he had encountered her that November afternoon in 1983. No insight into his thoughts or motivations during the commission of the crime. No opportunity for Sherry Joe's family to confront him or for the justice system to hold him accountable for his actions. The timing of his suicide suggested that Collins knew exactly why investigators had come to see him. His decision to end his own life rather than face the consequences of his actions 43 years earlier indicated both consciousness of guilt and unwillingness to accept responsibility. He had lived with the secret of what he had done to Sherry Joe for his entire adult life, and when faced with exposure, he chose death over accountability. Investigators pieced together what they could about Collins' life in the years following Sherry Joe's murder. He had lived quietly in the same general area where the crime occurred. He had not been arrested for any serious crimes in the intervening decades. To all outward appearances, he had been an ordinary member of his community. But he carried the secret of having kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered a 16-year-old girl, and that secret had finally caught up with him. The revelation that Collins was Sherry Joe's killer raised troubling questions about other unsolved crimes. Had he committed other sexual assaults or murders that remained unsolved? Had there been other victims whose cases might now be re-examined in light of his identification? Investigators began reviewing other cold cases from the same time period and geographic area, looking for possible connections. For Sherry Joe's family, the identification of her killer brought a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that they finally knew who had taken their daughter's life. Frustration that he had escaped justice through suicide. Anger that he had lived freely for 43 years while they struggled with unanswered questions and unresolved grief. And perhaps some measure of peace in knowing that their long wait for answers was finally over. The resolution of Sherry Joe's case represented both the power and limitations of modern forensic science. DNA technology and genealogical analysis had accomplished what traditional investigative methods could not, identifying a killer after more than 4 decades. But technology could not bring back the life that was lost or undo the decades of pain experienced by those who loved her. The case also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence from unsolved crimes, even when current technology cannot analyze it effectively. The biological evidence collected in 1983 had waited 40 years for the technology that could finally reveal its secrets. Without proper preservation, that crucial evidence would have been lost forever. Collins' suicide eliminated any possibility of learning more about his crimes or motivations. Criminal psychologists might speculate about what drove him to kill, but those questions would remain forever unanswered. The only certainty was that he had committed a horrible crime against an innocent teenager and had lived with that secret until the day advanced forensic science finally exposed him. As investigators closed the books on Sherry Joe's case, they reflected on the long journey from that November day in 1983 to the final identification of her killer in 2026. 43 years of investigation, involving dozens of detectives, laboratory technicians, and other professionals who refused to give up on finding justice for a murdered 16-year-old girl. Their persistence had finally been rewarded, even if the resolution was not everything they had hoped it would be. And so we reach the end of Sherry Joe's story, though in many ways, her story continues in the memories of those who loved her and in the lessons her case teaches us about the nature of justice and the passage of time. The resolution of her murder after 43 years reminds us that some truths cannot be buried forever, no matter how much time passes or how carefully they are hidden. Science, persistence, and the refusal to forget can eventually bring answers, even when those answers come too late for traditional justice. Ronald Collins lived for 43 years knowing what he had done to Sherry Joe. He experienced decades of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days while her family experienced those same occasions with her absence as a constant reminder of their loss. When finally faced with the consequences of his actions, he chose to rob them of the satisfaction of seeing him held accountable. But he could not rob them of the truth. Tonight, as you reflect on this story, consider the weight of secrets and the power of persistence. Consider the investigators who worked this case across multiple decades, never quite willing to let it go. Consider the family members who never stopped believing that someday, they would have answers. And consider the victim, 16-year-old Sherry Joe, whose life was cut short but whose memory demanded justice, even if that justice took nearly half a century to arrive. In the darkness of unsolved crimes, hope can seem fragile. But sometimes, hope is all we have. And sometimes, as in Sherry Joe's case, hope is enough. Thank you for listening tonight. Rest peacefully. If you're still awake after that, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Which case should we cover next?